Our scripture reading today comes from the book of John, chapter 14, verses 23 and 24. Jesus answered and said to him, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. He who does not love me does not keep my words, and the word which you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me." This is the word of our Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Boy, it got to me real quick. I thought it was further on in the service here. Well, if I love him, I will keep his word, and if I do, I will be his disciple, and he will be with me in discipleship. That's really what that was all about in the scriptures. So, good morning, everyone. As I said, Pastor John encouraged me to be here today and share my story with you. It's a story for me that came out of a year's worth of our discipleship huddle, and actually it made me very happy. So during the discipleship huddle, I had a sort of an epiphany or my Kairos moment, and I realized that being a good Christian, a disciple, is not really all that complicated, nor hard, actually. But actually, I was more scared about it than anything else. And I found out it's not complicated, it's not hard, and it's not scary. Wow. So all my anxiety and fears, such as what I'm feeling right now in front of you, about being a disciple, sort of got replaced. It got replaced by love and contentment and purpose. And it sort of mirrored the fact that I'm retiring from my job this past year, and I used the whole year to retire because it's hard to stop doing something you've done for so many years. And so this sort of was really helpful in many ways, both in my faith and in my life, and I want to share that today. So the purpose of my message is to share how I realized and learned that love is the essence of my faith, is the essence of becoming a disciple, and it's not scary or complicated. So my Kairos moment came in discipleship huddle, and I realized that it's not that complicated. Early on, in my life, I got entangled in my journey towards being a Christian. I got entangled with a lot of details and rules because I thought that's what you're supposed to do. What I mean, it's sort of like all the details and rules sort of, memorize all the scriptures, read every word in the Bible from front to back, pray constantly, pray about everything. Don't be shy about praying. Heal others when you can and pray for their healing. Say grace at every meal, one thing I can never do very well. It didn't matter where you were. The people I knew would have prayed, would have said grace at La Mer. They would have said grace in their home. They would have said grace at the L&L barbecue. So, it's those kinds of things. Being a good Christian and disciple, to me, I thought it was supposed to be out on the streets, saving souls of the unchurched and unpreached to, and the lost, and all these other little rules and things that I saw in what I thought were good Christians. And then I realized that I constantly felt guilty. I constantly criticized myself about not being Christian enough or not being a good disciple, or, every time the pastor passed out those monthly readings, the daily chapters in the Bible, I get a pang of guilt and then shame. So I was questioning my faith all the time. Well, I was into all these details of how to be faithful, concerned about being a proper Christian. But in trying to do all that, and trying to be a Christian, I lost sight of the bigger picture. I was lost in all these little religious rules or behaviors, sort of like hugging the religious trees, trying to understand each and every one of them, and not really seeing the larger picture, the big picture, the forest, not seeing the essence of being a Christian. And what I realized is that loving God and letting Him love you was the essence of being a good Christian. And if you love God and allow Him to love you, you'll find purpose, you'll find contentment and safety. So, I realized that Jesus made it real simple for me. I could start slowly and simply and start with this one commandment, the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. That's all you got to do. That's a big first step. And to just understand that one step would take a lifetime sometimes. And then there was a second one, even shorter and simpler. I was amazed. Love your neighbor. That's love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the two simple commandments. The entire Bible for me suddenly became clear. It became easier for me. Immediately I felt free and more natural and sort of relieved, actually. So by the end of this message, my hope is that you will find a take-home message that's a simple one too, as simple as it was that I found it to be. You don't need to be a biblical scholar or fanatic, but what you do need to do is commit yourself to 3 basic essential things. First, make these 2 commandments that I just said from Matthew, make them your life goals. That's what your life is all about. That's where you're headed. That's what you're trying to do. That's what you're trying to become. To live a faithful life. If you do that as your goal, you started on the way. Then I realized that if I needed some guidelines, and the only part of the Bible I actually read, and I will confess this, without being coerced, was really Matthew's chapters 5 through 7, which is the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. And for whatever reason, out of that entire book, that spoke to me, that kept me. I actually read it. I started to read it and I didn't stop until the end of the 7th chapter. They're guidelines to how you love God and how you love your neighbor. They're guidelines to how you live your life with love. For me, I don't know how many of you did this in college or high school, but to me, Matthew 5 through 7 is sort of like the Cliff Notes to the New Testament. It's like, that's all, if I just read that, I know what it's all about. And finally, the last thing is you can love God and you love your neighbor, you understand and you remember all these guidelines and how to love people and how to love God in the Sermon on the Mount. But it doesn't really mean much, because unless you use it and deliver it to your life through your gifts And I don't know if you recall, but a while back I gave an overview of our 5 gifts that we have. And frankly, I was trying to find words to substitute because sometimes these words scare people, like being an apostle. God, not me. A prophet. And so try to secularize it a bit, like so it's related to what you do in your everyday life. And I realized in my life, I use my gifts, and to some degree, I think of myself as a fairly good teacher. And teaching people in my business, whether it's a resident or an intern or a colleague in business, a chief operating officer who might be a little rough around the edges, I realized that those 2 commandments, the Sermon on the Mount, the guidelines, my guidelines, were helpful only if I were able to teach in a way for him. So that's, I think, is my gift. And I try to use that a lot. And I try to approach situations with that. But each of you have a gift. A lot of you, I've said this before, there are many of you here who really are pastors in their own way, taking care of people and the people in need. And I admire that because they also become apostles because they start up things and start involving people in the congregation and reaching out to others. And that's really what I'm talking about, is using those gifts, because then you can model your what you're doing. So that's the take-home message. I mean, I could stop here, and I think you would be relieved, but I'm going to go another 10 minutes and tell you how I got here, because I hopefully can tell the story quickly and sort of show how it all came to be for me. So in any case, this starts about, don't get worried, but it starts about 57 years ago, when I was about 15 or 16. And it was at the Somerset Congregational Church in Somerset, Massachusetts, established in 1790 or something like that. And I was in a youth group there, trying to become a member of the church through baptism, so you had to go through this process. And we got into that church because our neighbors were members of this church, and my parents were from China, or they didn't have a specific religion. And we were friends with the kids, so the kids all went over there. It was fun. And that's how I got into this. And as we were going through this training, this membership sort of seekers group, I guess, I would come up, and of course I'm 15, and I'm really into science, and in my life I was hoping to go and graduate and go to college doing biology or medicine or something like that. But in any case, I was into science, and through this process, it was several months, many meetings, I would periodically say, I'm not sure I believe in God. And I was afraid, but I finally said it because I figured they'd throw me out of the church. And expressed those doubts, and we had great discussions. But essentially, my pastor said, that's okay to doubt. You have to build your faith. It will come. But it's okay to doubt. But the real question for you, Rick, is what are you seeking? What are you trying to be? And so with all these questions, I realized that what I was seeking, I think, what I was seeking to be was a good Christian and believe in God. That's what I was seeking. I want to believe in God. I want to know if he really exists. I want to be able to have my faith in him. And my way of answering this big question was to try and learn and do all these behaviors I saw in some of my peers that I thought were great. Wow, they're really into this. And I admired them for that. And being a good scientist, I'm thinking, well, if I mimic that behavior, I should learn, it might come to me why those behaviors are happening. And if I mimic all these behaviors and thoughts and sayings, I'll become a Christian and eventually believe. So I really got into the trees, as it were. I got into all these things I was telling you about before. I tried to read and memorize scriptures. I bought at least 3 concordances throughout my lifetime, over 50, 60 years now, since I was 15. So if you're guessing, I'm 73 in a month or two. So I would buy books, that's one adaptive behavior that we all do, and keep bookstores in play. But I tried to attend as many Bible studies as I could. I figured, I might learn something. I might finally find what it is I'm looking for. And I probably bought at least $2,000 or $3,000 worth of audio tapes and videotapes and books and stuff like that. But I still felt uncomfortable. I couldn't say grace at meals, in public at least. I even tried later on, about 20 years ago, tried to write a paper about how you apply Christian values to business. Because I had a friend at work who used to say, the golden rule of business is do unto them before they do it to you. And I said, wait a minute, it's, that doesn't make sense. If you're good to people, they'll come back. They'll be good customers. And so I even tried to do that. And so it went. At bottom, I was becoming obsessed with all these little details of being a Christian, and with all the minutia, and essentially I became religiously nearsighted. Could only see these trees, and I was blind to the forest, to the bigger picture. That God loved me in spite of me. And it took 71 years to figure that out. So my Kairos moment actually came just before last Christmas. We were in discipleship huddle. We'd finished a bunch of stuff, the life shapes that the pastor talks about. And then we had to do our homework, which was go to Kahala Mall and seek out people and engage them to be a disciple. My worst fears about what a disciple is supposed to do. Essentially, I am shy with a veneer of bombastic behavior and thoughts, but I am essentially eternally shy and internally shy. So this was my worst nightmare. And I've gone through this whole Bible study, this whole huddle, and now you got to walk the talk. Like in the scriptures. You hear my words, and you love and listen and do what I say, and you're part of our discipleship. So I started looking at this confrontation between spreading his word and being a good Christian and just intruding on strangers' lives. I don't know how many, culturally that isn't even close to what I'm supposed to do, right? And then to do it is very uncomfortable. No matter how much Xanax I took, it wasn't really going to go away. But, so what did I do? Well, we discussed my fear, and the pastor's message became more clear to me. God, Jesus, loved me no matter where I was in my development as a Christian. You've heard that here in the sermons. And what I realized is that God doesn't need me to believe in him. He's going to believe in me, and he's going to love me no matter what. Suddenly, I don't know why, but it just made sense to me, and I stopped trying to prove that I'm a good Christian. It just stopped. And then we started saying, well, what can we do? Because it wasn't sitting down and reading a Bible with someone. There's no rule about that. So Linda had this great idea of having candy bars, because this was just before our Christmas Eve service. using these candy bars and putting our message on it. That is our Christmas Eve service, when to come, what time. And then we had a reason to come up to people and invite them. And frankly, it became an interesting process because they actually liked it. And they started talking about, gee, we're working that night, we wish we could come. And we said, well, we can't do a 10 o'clock service, unfortunately, but what I found was that people were open to it. They weren't scared, they weren't angry. It was reinforcing. And that was the turning point for me at that moment. And finally, I realized that it's in my head. The world I live in is not in my head. It's out here, it's in God's world. And that the rules, these trees, weren't really necessary. It's the forest that you have to be aware of. It's the singular fact that He loves you in spite of you, and that if you're open to it and love Him, then there will be a lot of things come into your life that you never saw before. A calmness, a contentment, and a feeling of safety. And this helped because as I'm retiring, I'm anxious, I'm restless, and I have no purpose. So this came at a perfect time for me. So the take home is a KISS. Keep it simple. And just remember these 3 commandments. I hope they're up there. The Lord your God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. And if you do those things using the Sermon on the Mount as guidelines, and this is my prescription. This is not UCC branded or approved, but this is what I got out of it, so beware of that. So if you do those things and follow the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, you can't help but be a disciple because you're going to be living Jesus' life. And by doing that, you will therefore go and make disciples of all nations. Just by doing that, by being you and loving God. So, I believe that He will meet me where I am. I'm not perfect, I'm not perfected. I'm flawed and willing. Scared and trembling right now. Simple-minded and curious, which I'm always kind of simple-minded, mostly curious. Simple because I only have to live like Jesus. Flawed because I'm learning and still selfish. I'm willing because I'm curious and challenging of myself. Scared because I may not truly understand how to love God, my neighbor, or how to bring His word to everyone. But I have a simple plan, and if you keep it simple, I have a higher chance of being successful. I thank God, and amen.